cloud opens the way an eyelid opens. One moment there is only the flat grey ceiling pressing down on the Bristol Scout's upper wing, the drone of the gnome engine, the smell of castor oil freezing to the cowling, and the endless white plate of the Filchner shelf sliding underneath at 90 knots. The next moment there is a hole. A round, ragged tear in the overcast, perhaps 2 miles across, and through it a shaft of low March sunlight falls onto the ice like a spotlight thrown from a hand no one can see. Anders Holmvik, 31 years old, second pilot to the Nordvik Auxiliary Survey out of Grytviken, banks the little biplane to the left because that is what any airman does when the weather gives him a window. He banks to look down through the hole, and through the hole he sees a valley, not a crevasse, not a nunatak field, not the blue shadow of a subsurface lake, a valley, sunk into the shelf the way a thumbprint is sunk into wax, perhaps 4 kilometers long, perhaps 1.5 kilometers wide at its broadest, with sloped ice walls that go down and down into a floor that is green. Green. The word does not belong in that latitude, and Holmvik knows it, and still writes it, later, 6 times in his flight log, underlined once, as if by underlining he can force the ink to hold what his eyes are holding now. A green floor, grass, or something like grass, in long combed strips along the low ground. Darker patches that must be scrub or dwarf trees, hunched, wind-shaped, growing in clusters near the water. And there is water. 2 lakes, black as poured tar in the sunlight, connected by a narrow river that curls between them, and a second river, thinner, silver, that comes down out of the eastern wall in a thread of steam. Steam. That is the detail that fixes him in the cockpit. The valley is exhaling. He can see the warm air rising off it in slow columns and meeting the polar cloud above and dissolving into it. And he understands, in the calm animal part of himself that flies the aircraft while the rest of him gapes, that this is why the cloud tore. The valley made the hole. The valley has been making the hole, perhaps for centuries, a warm mouth breathing straight up through the ice, and today, for the first time, a human being has flown across the opening at the exact minute the wind aligned to let the sun through. He throttles back. He is at 1,100 feet above the rim, which puts him perhaps 1,800 feet above the valley floor, and he can see, with the clarity that only cold, dry air gives you, the individual shapes of things on that floor. He sees the trees, he sees the shore of the nearer lake, and a paler line of what might be sand or bone meal along it. He sees, near the second lake, a low, regular ridge that does not look like a natural landform, that looks, he will write, like a wall laid down and forgotten. And he sees the shapes. There are, by his count, 7 of them. He will later say 9. The Norwegian technician who copied the 6 frames will say he counted 11 in one of the frames, though only 4 in the next. They are low to the ground. They are not men. They are not seals. Holmvik was a whaler's son from Vestfold. He had shot elephant seals as a boy on South Georgia. He knew what a seal looked like from the air, and he knew what a man looked like from the air, and he wrote, in the same underlined ink, "These are neither." They walked. That is the word he used. Walked on the grass between the trees, moving from the shore of the Black Lake toward the tree line in a loose, broken line, the way cattle move when they are not being driven. Their bodies were mounded, he said, heavy in the middle, low at the ends, the colour of wet clay or of a bruise going yellow. They cast shadows. He remembered the shadows very clearly because the shadows were the proof that they were solid and that the sun was on them, and the shadows were long and narrow and did not match the shape of the bodies that threw them, and he could not, later, explain that, and did not try. He reached forward and cranked the camera. The camera was a Debrie Parvo, mounted on a bracket the mechanic in Grytviken had welded onto the port strut 10 weeks earlier, aimed 40 degrees down and slightly forward. It held 120 feet of Kodak nitrate stock. Holmvik cranked it at 2 turns a second, which he had trained his hand to do without thinking, and he held the aircraft in a slow, flat left-hand turn to keep the valley floor inside the frame. He filmed for, at most, 40 seconds. He filmed the two lakes, and the river of steam, and the pale line along the shore, and the low, regular ridge that looked like a wall, and the 7 or 9 or 11 shapes moving between the trees, and then the cloud closed. It closed the way a mouth closes, not slowly. The wind higher up shifted, the tear knitted itself shut in perhaps 4 seconds, and the shaft of sunlight cut off at the ice like a snuffed candle, and Holmvik was flying again through flat grey overcast at 1,100 feet with nothing beneath him but white. He kept turning. He turned 3 complete circles above the spot where the hole had been, holding his altitude, watching for any second opening in the cloud, and none came. He noted the time in the log, 14 hours, 9 minutes, local. He noted the compass heading and the elapsed flight time from the tender ship, and from those 2 numbers he calculated a position that he wrote in the margin and then, some hours later, wrote again on the inside of his tobacco tin, in pencil, because he did not entirely trust the log to survive. Then he flew home. He flew for 2 hours and 20 minutes through worsening weather back to the tender in the Weddell Lee, and he landed on the strip of shore ice they had marked with red flags, and he climbed out of the cockpit, and the first thing he said to the mechanic who was walking toward him with a thermos was not about the cold or the engine or the ice. He said, in Norwegian, "There is a garden down there." He said it quietly. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided he will regret saying. And then he unbolted the film canister himself, with his gloves still on, and he carried it under his arm into the wardroom, and he did not let go of it for the next 9 days. The tender was the Sørhavet, a converted whaler out of Sandefjord under Norwegian registry but under British scientific charter, and this detail matters because it meant that everything Holmvik carried aboard belonged, by the fine print of the charter, to the Admiralty in London rather than to the man who had shot it. He seems to have understood this. The 9 days between his landing on the shore ice and the Sørhavet's arrival at Port Stanley were, by the account of the second engineer Christian Roald, the strangest of the voyage. Holmvik did not sleep in his bunk. He slept in the small dark room the expedition had rigged for meteorological plates, sitting upright on a stool with the canister on his lap and the door bolted from the inside. He ate there. He wrote there. Roald, who had to knock twice a day to deliver bromide solutions for the weather work, remembered that Holmvik would open the door only the width of a hand, take the tray, and close it again without a word. On the 4th day out, he asked Roald, through the door, whether the ship carried a technician who could develop cinema stock rather than plates. Roald said yes. He said the cook's assistant, a man named Trygve Ekelund, had worked 3 years in an Oslo film laboratory before going to sea. Holmvik was quiet for a long time behind the door. Then he said, "Send him. Ekelund is the reason we have anything at all." He was 26 years old, thin, consumptive, working the galley for the sea air his doctor had prescribed him, and he had in his personal kit a small hand-cranked contact printer of the sort used in Scandinavian provincial cinemas to make replacement title cards. It was not designed for negative stock, and it was not designed for the format Holmvik's camera used, but Ekelund was a patient man, and Holmvik, by the 5th day, was a frightened one. Together, in the dark room of the Sørhavet, working by the red bulb, they developed the original reel in trays of chemistry mixed from what the meteorological locker could spare. Ekelund later wrote, in a private letter recovered from his sister's estate in 1974 and now held at the Norsk Film Institute under accession number NFIBR 1974/118, that when the image came up in the tray, he stopped breathing for what he estimated to be nearly a minute. He described what he saw in 5 short lines: water without ice, trees, or something like trees, a wall, figures, and one of the figures, he wrote, appeared to be carrying another. Holmvik would not let the full reel out of his hands. But he permitted Headland over the next 2 nights to contact print 6 individual frames onto ordinary photographic paper. Frames Holmvik chose himself, and these 6 prints Headland hid inside the false back of a wooden cigar box that had belonged to his father. That cigar box travelled with him for the rest of his short life. He died of tuberculosis in Bergen in 1919. The box passed to his sister Ingrid, then to her son, then in 1974 to the Institute, where 4 of the 6 prints survive in a condition the archivists describe as heavily fogged but legible. 2 of them are the frames most often reproduced in the small, quiet literature on this case. The others have never been published. The Sørhavet made Port Stanley on the 22nd of March. 2 officers in Admiralty uniform were waiting on the dock. They did not board as visitors. They boarded with a signed order in the name of the Governor of the Falkland Islands dependencies, requisitioning all photographic and cinematographic material produced during the flight of the 17th on the grounds of imperial scientific priority. Holmvik surrendered the canister on the wardroom table. He was not arrested. He was not even formally debriefed. He was thanked in writing and paid the remainder of his contract in sterling and told that the Admiralty would be in touch regarding possible future employment. He never heard from them again. The canister travelled north on the mail packet Arabia and was signed into the Admiralty Hydrographic Office in London on the 11th of May, 1913, where its receipt is recorded in Ledger H/1913/442 as 1 tin, cinematographic, Antarctic, Holmvik. After that entry, the trail inside the Admiralty goes cold for exactly 71 days. On the 21st of July, 1913, a short internal memorandum was circulated to the hydrographer of the Navy, to the chart branch, and to 2 named officers in naval intelligence. The memo has been declassified since 1996 and can be read with some effort in the National Archives at Kew under reference ADM 116/1287. It is 4 sentences long. It refers to the material only as the Weddell footage. It states that the feature depicted is not to appear on any chart, published or internal, of the Antarctic coast. It states that no reference to the feature is to be made in any publication of the Royal Geographical Society or the Hydrographic Office. And it states, in the final sentence, that the reel itself is to be retained in the restricted materials safe pending. And here the sentence simply ends, pending further determination. No further determination is on file. The reel is not in the safe today. There is no record of when it left, or who signed it out, or where it went. Holmvik, meanwhile, went to Buenos Aires. He went because his wife's family were there, Norwegian shipping people in the Baracas district, and because he had, by the summer of 1913, developed what his brother-in-law later described in a deposition as a terror of cold water. He would not bathe in the sea. He would not take the ferry across the Plate. He drank only boiled water, and he drank it hot. He took rooms above a chandlery on Calle Necochea, and he wrote, in the evenings, what appears from surviving fragments to have been a long private account of the flight, in Norwegian, in a bound ledger. That ledger has never been found. What has been found is the police report of the 14th of February, 1914, filed by Comisaria 24 of the Buenos Aires Police, describing the discovery of the body of one Anders Holmvik, 38 years of age, Norwegian national, in the water closet of his rooming house. He was found kneeling. His face and upper body were submerged in a galvanized tin tub of fresh water that the landlady kept for laundering. The tub held approximately 40 litres. There were no marks of violence. The door had been locked from the inside. In the pockets of his trousers, the attending officer noted, were quantities of a dark, fine-grained soil, damp, of a kind the officer described as garden earth, which was strange because the rooming house had no garden, and Holmvik had not, so far as anyone knew, left the building in 3 days. The soil was placed in an evidence envelope. The envelope was logged. The envelope, like the ledger, like the real, like the 71 silent days in London, is not now where it is supposed to be. And this is the shape the whole case takes as you work through it. A shape I found myself drawing in the margin of my notes without meaning to, a shape like a hand closing around something and then opening again, empty. 6 prints in a cigar box in Bergen. 4 sentences in a memo at Kew, a line in a ledger, a police report in Spanish, and around all of it the same unanswered question, the one Ekelund wrote in his letter, and the one the Admiralty would not put on paper, and the one Holmvik carried into a tub of fresh water in a hot city 3,000 miles from the ice. What were the mounded shapes moving between the trees, and why was it worth the quiet, careful effort of a navy to make sure you would never be allowed to ask? And you cannot ask now in the practical sense because the valley is not there to be visited. I want to be careful about what I mean by that. I do not mean that it never existed. I mean that the physical, navigational, cartographic route back to whatever Holmvik banked over on the 14th of March, 1912, has been closed by 3 separate processes, and any one of them would be sufficient on its own. The first is the ice itself. Holmvik's flight path, insofar as it can be reconstructed from the fuel log of the Sørland and the bearing notations Ekelund copied before the canister was taken, carried him inland from a point on the Larsen Shelf that in 1912 stood roughly 40 kilometers further seaward than it stands today. The shelf has advanced, retreated, carved and rewelded 4 times in the intervening century. The 1947 Rhône survey, the 1957 IGY overflights, and the 2002 breakup of Larsen B have between them rewritten every surface feature in that quadrant. Whatever depression Holmvik looked down into, whether it was a true valley cut into bedrock or a transient collapse in the shelf itself, is now buried under an unknown thickness of accumulated ice, or has drifted north as part of a berg and melted into the Weddell Sea, or has been sealed shut by the slow tectonic breathing of the continent. The Antarctic does not preserve landmarks, it edits them. The second process is the deliberate one. The bearings Holmvik gave to Ekelund in the 12 hours before the Admiralty officers arrived at Port Stanley were, according to Ekelund's own later account, a latitude and a longitude expressed to the nearest minute. Those numbers appear nowhere in the surviving British record. They do not appear in the 1913 memo. They do not appear in the chart corrections issued to Royal Navy vessels operating in the South Atlantic in 1913, 1914 or 1915. They do not appear in the Discovery Investigations files opened in 1924. When, in 1956, a junior researcher at the Scott Polar Research Institute requested the Holmvik file under an internal reference, he received a reply that the file had been reviewed and found to contain no material of scientific interest, and the reference number was reassigned. The coordinates were not lost, they were removed. There is a difference, and the difference is the whole point of this story. The third process is the one that hurts the most because it is the one that could still, in theory, have saved us. The 6 frames Ekelund printed in Port Stanley, the frames that show the rivers, the black lakes, the low-mounded shapes between what look like trees, survived in a cigar box in a house in Bergen for 61 years before they were donated in 1974 to a small maritime archive that has since been absorbed twice. I have held them. I have held them in cotton gloves under a lamp in a reading room, and I can tell you that 4 of the 6 are now, for practical purposes, green fog. The silver has migrated, the gelatin has bloomed. What was, in the 1913 contact print Ekelund made, a recognizable landscape has become a soft, translucent, poisonous green haze in which shapes suggest themselves and refuse to hold. Digital enhancement has been attempted 3 times, most recently in 2019 by a team at the University of Tromsø, and the honest report of that team is that the frames contain, at this point, more artifact than information. The valley, having survived the ice and survived the Admiralty, is being eaten by its own chemistry. So let me now do the thing I owe you, because I would not trust a narrator who did not do it. Let me put the strongest sober case against everything I have just told you, and let me weigh it honestly. The sober case runs like this. West Antarctica sits over a broad region of elevated geothermal flux. We know, from radar surveys conducted since the 1990s, that there are subglacial lakes beneath the ice sheet, Lake Vostok, Lake Whillans, at least 400 others, and that in some places the ice thins to a few hundred meters above liquid water warmed from below. It is not, on this account, impossible that in March of 1912 a section of the shelf briefly collapsed inward over such a warmed pocket, producing a depression in which relatively warmer air pooled, in which meltwater ran in braided channels, in which the light through disturbed air produced the illusion of green. The mounded shapes, on this account, are elephant seals, which do haul out on shelf ice, which are dark, which are large, which move with a rolling gait that from 800 feet through a vibrating celluloid frame at 16 exposures per second could easily suggest something more upright than they are. The trees are shadow. The heat is refraction. Holmvik, cold, oxygen-starved at altitude in an open cockpit, saw what tired pilots have always seen, a katabatic mirage, the polar equivalent of the desert lake, and he photographed it in perfect good faith. I find this persuasive. I want you to hear that clearly. I find it persuasive enough that I spent 2 weeks after my first reading of the Headland letter trying to talk myself entirely into it, and I nearly succeeded. It explains the green. It explains the movement. It explains, if you stretch, even the warmth Holmvik claimed to feel on his face as he banked. It does not require a conspiracy. It requires only an admiralty embarrassed by a sensational reel in a year when it did not want sensational reels about the Southern Ocean, and a pilot who came apart, as pilots sometimes came apart, in a rooming house in a hot city 11 months later. It explains, I would say, 4/5 of the file. It does not explain the soil in his pockets, and I will set that aside because soil can be argued about. It does not explain the 71 silent days, and I will set that aside because bureaucracies are silent for many reasons. What it does not explain, and what no version of the sober case I have ever read has been able to explain, is the last salvageable frame. Frame 6. The frame Headland numbered in pencil on the back, in the corner, with a small underscored 6. It is the least degraded of the surviving prints, because it was the one he kept at the bottom of the box, pressed flat, away from light. And in frame 6, one of the mounded shapes, which in frames 1 through 5 is moving between the pale vertical forms Holmvik called trees, has stopped. It is not walking, it is standing. And its head, if it is a head, and the sober case requires that it is only the forward hump of a seal, is tilted back along an axis that, when you draw the line, points directly up and slightly astern, to exactly the position a small biplane would have occupied in the sky above it at the moment the shutter opened. An elephant seal does not look up at an aeroplane. An elephant seal in 1912 had no concept of an aeroplane to look up at, and even if it had, it would not have held the pose for the fraction of a second required to freeze on a plate of nitrate film, at that angle, with what one begins, against one's will, to read as attention. I have looked at frame 6 more times than I care to admit. I have looked at it under a loupe, under a light box, under the flatbed at 1200 dots per inch, and again at 2400. I have looked at it beside plates of southern elephant seals in every posture the literature records, the trumpeting male with his head thrown back, the yearling craning at a skua, the wounded bull rearing on the sand at South Georgia, in the Kinnear photographs of 1908. I have compared the angle of the tilt. I have measured, with a protractor on a print, the line from the base of what the sober case calls a neck to the tip of what the sober case calls a snout, and I have carried that line up through the grey of the sky in the frame, and it arrives, every time, at the same place, slightly aft of centre, slightly above the horizon of the valley wall, exactly where a Farman biplane banking east at roughly 400 meters would have hung for the half-second Holmvik's shutter was open. It is the geometry that will not leave me alone, not the shape. The shape can be argued, the geometry cannot. And so I keep coming back to the deck of the small hangar in Port Stanley and to Holmvik himself on the 16th of March 1912, unbuckling from the cockpit with his hands still shaking and the canister still warm from the friction of the crank, telling the Norwegian mechanic, in Norwegian, so that the two English airmen standing nearby would not follow, that the things in the valley had seen him. Not that he had seen them, that they had seen him. The mechanic wrote this down years later in a letter to his sister in Bergen, a letter that survives in the Hordaland Regional Archive under the reference PA-442, and it is one of the few pieces of testimony in this entire file that was written without any expectation of an audience. He was telling his sister about a strange day. He mentioned, almost in passing, that the pilot had come down white and had said, over and over, at track hodet backover. It leaned its head back. It leaned its head back, and it looked at me. I do not know what to do with that sentence. I have carried it for a long time. There is a version of this story I could tell you in which I close the file cleanly, in which I say the reel is gone, the pilot is gone, the valley is under a kilometre of reclosed ice at coordinates no living hand can now supply, and the 6 frames Ekeland saved have degraded, as nitrate degrades, into a green fog that could be almost anything a tired eye wants it to be, in which I say the Admiralty memo of April 1913 was one of thousands of small acts of institutional tidying up, and Holmvik's death in a freshwater tub in a Buenos Aires rooming house was one of thousands of small deaths of men who had flown too early and too alone, in which the soil in his pockets was picked up in a botanical garden on the Avenida Sarmiento, and the 71 silent days were the ordinary silence of an ordinary office, in which none of it means anything, and the frame is a seal. I have tried to write that version. It will not hold together at the last joint. It comes apart at frame 6, at that tilted head, at the line drawn upward through the sky to the exact place the aeroplane was, so I will leave you where I began. Above the shelf, in March 1912, in the cold, thin air of a break in the cloud, with a young Norwegian pilot leaning out of an open cockpit and looking down into a pocket of impossible warmth. Rivers, black and slow, lakes without ice, pale vertical forms he could only think to call trees, and, moving between them, low mounded shapes, unhurried, going about whatever it was they went about in a place that on every chart of the world was supposed to be nothing but white. He cranks the camera. The shutter opens and closes and opens and closes. 6 times, 7 times, the frames we now have and the frames we will never have. And in one of those exposures, in the fraction of a second the aperture is open, one of the shapes on the valley floor stops walking. It stands. It lifts its head. It looks up through 400 meters of clear polar air, through the frame, through the celluloid, through the century between us, and it holds that look for exactly as long as it takes a plate of nitrate to remember it forever. Holmvik banked away. The cloud closed. He flew home and told a mechanic, in a language the officers around him did not speak, that the things in the valley had seen him. 11 months later, he was dead in a tub of fresh water with valley soil in his pockets. The reel was taken. The coordinates were scrubbed. The chart was ordered clean. The ice moved back over whatever it was moving over, and the frames faded to green fog, and the file thinned and thinned and thinned, until all that was left was one flat print at the bottom of an engineer's box, pressed away from the light, with a small underscored 6 in the corner, and a head tilted back at the exact angle of the aeroplane. I cannot tell you what looked up at Anders Holmvik out of that green valley under the ice. I cannot tell you what walked between the trees that should not have been trees, in a warmth that should not have been warmth, in a place the Admiralty decided in the spring of 1913 was better left off every chart the Empire printed. I cannot tell you why he drowned in fresh water in a hot city, or who was in the room with him, or whether anyone was. I can only tell you what the last frame shows, a shape standing still in a place that on our maps does not exist, looking up. And I would like, very much, to know what it saw.